was going to point that to you.
It's the same.
Yeah, let's point that out. Gives you a really good idea.
This doesn't. Press that.
I love your math. Wonderful. That's great. Jackie?
Hey, hey, Kade, there's your water. You guys are not fighting over the one glass.
Oh, yeah. Okay, yours is over there. Mine is over here. Oh.
Okay. All right.
Take it down for you?
Just like probably in there,
Okay.
because it hurts me to sit on that.
Okay, everyone ready to get started? Welcome everyone to this afternoon talk between the artists of Postcommodity, Kade Twist and Cristóbal Martínez, and curator Dr. Gerald McMaster. We are gathered on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to First Nations and Métis ancestors and reaffirm our relationship with one another. Today marks the opening of Postcommodity's new exhibition, Time Holds All the Answers, an exhibition that at its very core is a critical acknowledgement of land and the complexities of our relations and shared responsibilities. Today we'll hear more from the artist and curator about the exhibition, as well as the broader scope of Postcommodity's practice. Following the talk, we will regroup at Wanaskewin at 3:30 for an outdoor reception and guided hike to the Medicine Wheel. If you're joining us there, note that the museum has covered parking fees and admission, so there are no additional costs. Please just head straight in and join us on the outdoor terrace. I also want to highlight that the exhibition is accompanied by a major monograph, which will go to print as soon as we have photographs of the beautiful works upstairs. So please stay tuned for the catalog launch and associated programming later this fall. Postcommodity is an interdisciplinary arts collective founded in the mid-2000s, currently comprised of Cristóbal Martínez and Kade Twist. They create works of art through a shared Indigenous lens and voice, examining aspects of 21st century life to inspire a uniquely Indigenous vision of the future. The collective has exhibited internationally, including at Documenta 14, the 57th Carnegie International in Pittsburgh, where they are awarded the Fine Prize, the 2017 Whitney Biennial, and the 18th Biennial of Sydney, curated by none other than Gerald McMaster. If you have been following the collective's work for over the years, you know how powerful their ideas are and how they model a unique learning community working collectively and collaboratively, encompassing technology, poetry, linguistics, sound, installation, and performance. I'm going to give a bit of an introduction to Gerald and his team at Wapatah, and then Gerald will be introducing the artists more in depth. Dr. Gerald McMaster is a leading nationally and internationally voice with over 30 years of experience in contemporary art, critical theory, museology, and Indigenous aesthetics. He is Nehiyaw from Red Pheasant Cree Nation and a member of the Siksika Nation. He served as the Canadian Commissioner for the 1995 Venice Biennial, Artistic Director of the 2012 Biennale of Sydney, and Curator of the 2018 Venice Biennale of Architecture. McMaster has served as Adjunct Curator for Remai Modern since 2018, and he is a Tier 1 Canadian Research Chair and Director of Wapatah Centre for Indigenous Visual Knowledge at OCAD University in Toronto. And what Gerald is doing there is really quite new and quite leading in terms of how he's working with his team there. So I just wanted to share a little bit more about Wapatah and what they do. Wapatah Centre for Indigenous Visual Knowledge is a hub for facilitating the documentation, communication, and interpretation of Indigenous ways of seeing at OCAD University in Toronto. Drawing on the inseparable concepts of perception and knowing, Wapatah assists Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists and researchers to collaborate on the engagement with and representation of artistic knowledge. And we have some of Wapatah's contributing team members with us here today, Dr. Michael Rattray and Panya Clark-Espinal, and our collaborators back in Toronto, Alicia Pignotti and Natalia Chestopolova, have all been integral in realizing the project. Other collaborators include Sébastien Aubin and his design studio in Montreal, who are working on the catalog and as well produced the jerry-canned custom font you'll see upstairs in the exhibition. Saskatoon architect Laurie McGillivray-Morose helped translate some wild ideas into the complex structures you'll see upstairs, and the incredibly talented team at Remai Modern, who went above and beyond to realize an exhibition that required all manner of skills, finesse, and muscle. Time Holds All the Answers is a truly extraordinary project in its scope, complexity, and ambition. Discussions for this project began in the summer of 2018, and the artists first visited Saskatoon in May of 2019, when the work got underway in earnest. From the outset, we knew that the artists would challenge us, and as a museum, we knew these challenges would help us grow. No one could have anticipated that the project would have to see its way through a worldwide pandemic, and it's a testament to everyone involved with the project that we held on through a multitude of personal and institutional pressures. To me, Time Holds All the Answers is an incredible expression of Remai Modern's potential to support artists and their visions to the fullest extent. All but one of the works upstairs are new, and each one is demanding, technically, intellectually, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And it's as if the whole museum has been organized around the artworks themselves. There's a shift in atmosphere of gravity, a bending or collapsing of very time and space in the museum. As Cristóbal and Kade have said, this is an efficient finish line for these works. This is where they begin. They come to life through experience and the making of personal and collective meaning. After the talk, we will have some time for questions from the audience as well as those joining us on the live stream. So if you are in-house, please put up your hand and Rachel will guide you to the podium so we can capture your question on the microphone. Thank you, Kade, Cristóbal, and Gerald, for everything that you are sharing with us, and please join me in welcoming these brilliant minds and hearts to the conversation.
Dansiga gyo kinaskum no. Mina nanaskuten oma kisagao. Kinaskum ten kinaskum no kape nito tawinana nos. Aha, aiwa. Ni tsagana koge. Inote bixquetic.
Well, thank you everyone for being here with us today. We'd like to make a very simple and sincere statement. We'd like to state that Postcommodity are deeply honored to be guests on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis.
And we pay our respects to First Nations and Métis ancestors and affirm our relationship with one another now in the present time. Thank you.
We'd also like to thank citizens of Saskatoon and Remai Modern Museum for also having us as guests. We have been here for about 2.5 weeks and have really enjoyed our time here. And so thank you to many of you whom we've met for your hospitality and your support and your friendship. Thank you.
Oh, thank you guys. All right. Rose forgot to indicate that she was a student at one of my classes. She's gone on to do very well.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm going to introduce the artists here today who I've had the pleasure and honor of working with for the past 2 years. In fact, I've been working with them for over a dozen years now. At least I've known them. So I want to start on my far left, Cristóbal Martínez. I think you were introduced to earlier. Cristóbal is mestizo from the Genizaro Pueblo, Manito, and Chicano heritages of northern New Mexico. And he grew up in Alcalde, New Mexico. If any of you are familiar with New Mexico, it's northwest of Santa Fe. Cristóbal is an interdisciplinary artist and indigenous media scholar. In 2003, he co-founded the artist hacker performance ensemble Radio Healer. In 2009, he collaborated with Postcommodity and then became a member of Postcommodity in 2010. In 2018, he co-founded the experimental, that's right, I was going to say experiential, I guess it could be experiential, yeah. Experimental electronic music group Red Culebra, which means snake, I believe, in Spanish. Did I pronounce that correctly? Culebra?
That's good.
Just like the Kade pic that you'll see out in the installation here later. Drawing on a continuum to his art practices, Cristóbal is chair and associate professor of art and technology at the San Francisco Art Institute. And in 2015, he earned his doctorate from the Arizona State University in rhetoric, composition, and linguistics after completing his dissertation on indigenous technological sovereignty. Kade Twist is a member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and grew up in Bakersfield, California. And I think between the two of them, you'll see a lot of their homeland territory where they grew up in this exhibition. Kade is an interdisciplinary artist, poet, and co-founding member along with Stephen Yazzie of Postcommodity. Kade is a 2015 United States Artist Klein Fellow for Visual Arts and a recipient of the 2007 Native Writers Circle of the Americas First Book Award for the title Amazing Grace. And recently he published a book-length poem called Marginal Equity with publication Studio Guelph in 2018. In addition to his creative practice, Kade is a professor in the Master of Fine Arts department at the Otis College of Art and Design in Los Angeles, California, and is a recent retiree from the field, not from his job, but from the field of public policy, where he specialized in American Indian technology, healthcare, and community development for nearly 20 years. So, gentlemen, welcome to Saskatoon, which is named after a berry. I hope you'll have a chance to eat Saskatoon berry pie while you're here.
Oh, yeah.
Okay?
You bet.
So let me ask, I think the first question we're probably all wanting to ask, Postcommodity, the name Postcommodity, all right? Perhaps you might want to talk about that. I mentioned Stephen Yazzie. There were other members of Postcommodity, so give us a bit of background on who you guys are, all right?
Well, we walk in I think we were walking on a trail that a lot of Canadian artists actually paved for us, you know, like Edward Portress and Rebecca Belmore and folks of that stature. We wanted to continue that type of work. And we also wanted to shift the indigenous discourses from, and this was a shared desire of all of us at the table, we wanted to get out of this feedback loop to where we're creating narratives of us versus them, and we're doing it in a way that's very self-reflexive, almost like looking into a mirror and just limiting your scope of work just to what you find in the mirror. We wanted to take that indigenous lens and point it outward and to focus on the social, political, economic implications of our contemporary world, and let the indigeneity speak through our tactics and strategies and discourses, rather than chase the aesthetics of visual expectations of indigenous work with like feathers and animal byproducts and things like that, and focus on the ideas. And I think that's what brought everyone together, that and a love of sound, a love of experimental music and compositions and performance. And so I think that's what we wanted to do. And the name Postcommodity, you think about, oftentimes Indian people are defined by their relationships with commodities, or our relationship with the federal government is often defined by our relationship to commodities, and commodities being the old school white foods that supplanted our indigenous diets after subjugation here in the hemisphere. And it's like in the U.S. it's USDA commodities, and it's low-income food subsidies, white flour, lard, sugar, salt. It's canned meat that turns kind of white. But it's that type. We wanted to take the jokes about commodities and the discussions and just, okay, that's been done for quite some time. Let's push towards a more desirable future and a more diverse discourse and a more nuanced discourse. And I think, so post-commodity, moving beyond those commodities, another thing is this, in the field of cultural anthropology, post-commodity is a term of art to describe the transformative relationships that humans have with the objects that they purchase and collect and use. So we wanted to reference, that type of complexity, the market transformation, the mediation that objects have in our psychological, cultural lives, our worldview, and really question what is our relationship, not just with the federal government, with each other, and let's not weaponize, what we are and who we are. Let's try to find syncretic forms to collaborate and to think together across worldview and across culture, across difference. And that was kind of the thing that was brought to the table that we all got behind. And we wrote a couple long run-on sentences that in 2007 that we've maintained as kind of our mission.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
Cristóbal.
if you think about what we do in terms of our aspirations to create works of art that are generative, that try to mitigate us versus them discourses and binary discourses, that we hope that what we model through an indigenous lens, although it's coming from an indigenous perspective, that everybody would be able to see themselves, indigenous and non-indigenous people alike, in the narratives that we share and we are suspended by and we co-inhabit together. And so if you think about like commodities, for example, like commodity foods, like the white foods that Kade spoke of, and how those foods were used to supplant indigenous food sovereignty, these things are layered upon one another. You can start to think about how the food industry and corporations have done it to all of us. And so we're all suffering from various diseases and health problems and really finding ourselves further and further away from healthy foods and healthy living, healthy lifestyles. And so, and while at the same time we get the added benefit of destroying our planet in the process. And so one thing that I'd like to share that that we often do share with people. And when I think about post-commodity in an expansive way, I think about a time in the future, and this is perhaps the future as part of, an aspect of the future as part of what we do, is that in the future, people are no longer defined, or people are no longer valued in relationship to their capacity to spend and consume. That is no longer the marker of value of an individual in this world.
Did you want to say anything about acknowledge some of your previous members? Talk about them.
You know,
Absolutely. Thank
one of the co-founders, Nathan Young, in addition to Stephen Yazzie, you know, Nathan is Pawnee, Delaware, Kiowa, really good friend, went to University of Oklahoma together and sat in some of the same classes together and had similar responses. And, you know, we took some art classes together, and we wanted to find ways to, we didn't know what it meant, you know, collaborative, develop a collaborative practice, develop a collective, bring some Indian people together and make some work. We had those really loose ambitions dating back to 1997 together. And so he played a really important role, and so did his family, in helping to facilitate some of our early meetings. And yeah, that was great. And Raven Chacon, the composer and sound artist, we had an opportunity to work with him. And it's interesting because you think about the three of them, and, you know, Yazzie was really wanting to break out from, you know, the two-dimensional plane and get into conceptualism and get into, you know, really look at the line between performance, sculpture, and installation. And, you know, he was brought that desire to the table. And I think Nathan wanted to work with video in formats that were outside of traditional, you know, native film formats of the single screen theater, you know, film festivals and things like that. And I think Raven, you know, he really wanted to resolve some, I think, some sound art practices and just wildly experiment. And they each, with their own interests, brought a lot of knowledge to the table, and a lot of, you know, applied knowledge, technical knowledge that we were all able to share and reassess together and realign and create this formation that Postcommodity is. And you know, Cristóbal, just you know his bio, but at the time in 2009, he flipped a switch for us in terms of how to manage content in ways that we didn't have the capacity to do, and manage content through, you know, software engineering and design and things like that. And I think the way he opened our minds as a group to how to think about, you know, experiential media and experimental media environments, you could apply that same type of sweet spot that we all brought to the table, you know. So it's been a really exciting time, and I think that all of the contributors have been extraordinary. And all of them are amazing artists. I think Yazzie's the best painter of his generation, and Nathan's one of the great filmmakers of his generation, and Raven is one of the great sound artists of his generation. So.
Yeah, I've worked with Yazzie and you on a show many years ago, so and I know you guys have put me on the spot on some of your works before, and we won't talk about it, but quite surprising. But I've known you guys for a number of years, right? Over 10 years now. The last project we worked on together was the Biennale of Sydney, and back in 2012 for a work called Do You Remember When? And unfortunately, we don't have a photograph of it up here, but what they managed to do was to do, at first the work began at Arizona State University, where they managed to cut a hole in the gallery. Now, we can talk about that, but I think just that idea of having interventions and doing a work that is nonconformist perhaps in the museum space. We're going to talk about that in relation to some of the work that you've done here, okay, here at Remai Modern. But here we are in Saskatoon, Saskabush, as sometimes we commonly, well, I used to in the old days, where I got my career many, many years ago, and I spoke about that the other night. But for you guys here at Remai Modern, it's really a career-defining, mid-career-defining moment for you. And I'm really excited about that. You mentioned earlier you've exhibited in Canada many times, in fact, and I remember some folks thought you were Canadian. You know, you were up here so often. So, but I think the audience is kind of curious about your thoughts about exhibiting here at Remai Modern, because it is certainly one of the finest museums in Canada. So give us your thoughts about this exhibition and your exhibiting here, coming here.
Okay.
Take a
crack. Yeah, and I'll add to it.
Well,
That's one of my favorite questions.
I think it's really quite remarkable. Thinking about Saskatoon, thinking about Remai Modern, thinking about Gerald, thinking about Wanaskewin. These are all things in the world, in the universe, that are very sympathetic to one another, and serendipitously and through great intention came together. And so, you know, for us, we've always considered Gerald to be a great mentor to us. We've always we've sought his advice many times, and we've learned a great deal from what he has shared with us, his experiences, and he's consequently affected us in an absolutely positive and productive way. And the idea that Gerald, this is Gerald's hometown, and it's like a big circle. We've traveled in a big circle, in a way, beginning with Gerald in the early phases of the collective, and here we are now at the midpoint of our collective, and we're sitting with Gerald again in a way that is so honorable and so humbling and so powerful that it's just impossible to walk amongst the art that we all created together and collaborated on, not feel a sense of deep emotion. And so I believe it's a combination of being invited, being called upon to rise to the occasion, and having an opportunity to remember and care for our ancestors, and thinking that our ancestors are certainly providing a map or a direction, a knowledge, a guide, which is clearly encoded into this great prayer that we've established upstairs. I just don't know how these things happen in life. But I know that we have prepared ourselves to adapt to callings when when they come. And that's precisely what we've done here. And Gerald, I don't know if this embarrasses you, and so please forgive me, but Gerald has shared with us that he's looking at, he's a grandfather, and he's a father, and some of his family is here, and I'm eager to meet some of you. There's a phase, there's a cycle in life, and we're in a particular moment, all three of us. And the fact that we're here to travel together and be together in this point is the reason why I believe we're here, and that we get to share it with the public is one of the greatest honors of our lives. So
Thank you.
I'm going to stop there because it's getting too,
Well,
getting too great, getting too heavy.
We'll lighten it up.
I'm sorry that that's
that's fine.
the place that I'm leaving us on.
No, I mean it's important, and it has a lot of meaning and purpose. And this it's such an important question, because the art world's collide in cities like New York and LA and Berlin and London and whatnot. And it's heavily driven by, it's driven, by the market, especially in the US. The art world is about sales in the US. And it's not to say that it's not about sales elsewhere, but in Canada, the market has been mitigated quite a bit. The art world here is insulated just enough from the market to where you see something really unique rise from the art histories here. You see a privileging of conceptualism and dreaming through work, just wild ass dreaming, imagining a present or a future without considering the types of market-driven intentions that have to be considered in work that's developed in the U.S. So the culture around art is different. And the art communities that we've experienced here in places like Saskatoon and places like Winnipeg, which are two great art towns with significant arts infrastructure. But it's the actual artists that make it, and the willingness to share and to pitch in and share gear, share time, and work on each other's work. I think that speaks to one of the reasons why exhibiting in Canada is so much fun, because we get to remain in the Americas, but we get to see and experience an entirely different way of navigating this experiment. In the U.S., they always say it's an experiment of democracy. Well, so is Canada. And it's nice to see how these experiments have unfolded in vastly different ways, and how the market has been mitigated in a place like, in a nation like Canada. It's not to say the market isn't devastating, and Canada doesn't have some of the most destructive resource extraction and processing industries in the world, and its fair share of global multinational corporations. But in the aggregate, it is a spiritual difference and a cultural difference that is really great to experience as a human being, and really nice to experience as an artist. So there's that thing here that you have to come here to access, and really, really appreciate that. There's also this, it's the place, it's the space, it's the land, the people, the culture, and the communities that are here, that where we can find continuity, where we can examine some of the complexities of our continuity and from that continuity, we can also look at some of the challenges and differences that we have. And the conversations are always so intense up here. And there's such a literate tradition around some of these issues, especially in the indigenous communities. So that is priceless to access, and you have to come here to access. And then we talked about working with Gerald as a mentor and the power of that, you know, working with a significant figure in the art world at a really important time in all of our careers and lives and everything like that. That's great, but the business that we're at is modeling what art is, how art functions in society, how it functions within institutions. We're not modeling this to, we're modeling a future, right? And sometimes you have to go back to a place like a Canada and work with a giant figure like Gerald to get to the point of modeling, or to a space where you can model. And by modeling a future, I mean, this is an art world that includes indigenous people to exercise their cultural self-determination in a public space without shame, you know. And not only that, with the full breadth of support, trust, and honor of the community that you're working within. You know, that balance was achieved through this, so we were able to model something that's very rare, I think, in the art world. And in the US, and I just don't think a show like this would ever get curated and staged in a place that's beautiful. It might get curated and staged in an awkward, you know, space where we have to the DIY style it. So it's something that we're doing here that's bigger than all of us. It's not about this exhibition. It is about modeling platforms and modeling public discourses so that there's space for people not to speak through a world view of people and have a gun to your head so that you're mimicking the words of a dominant culture, a dominant worldview. That's not the case at all. We're talking about total cultural sovereignty and self-determination has been embraced and exercised and pushed and exalted and reaffirmed. And that is a different story altogether. And I think that's what Wapatah Institute has been about. That's Gerald's practice, what it's been about. The endeavors of the National Museum of the American Indian, it couldn't achieve it, you know, but it started with that point. At some point it might be able to achieve it, but this has been able to achieve that. And that's why we come to Canada, is to experience a way to model something that's more desirable for the future.
Now, what's interesting, and you guys are talking about that, coming from the US, crossing the borders, right? For you, it's not so much a political thing of crossing borders, right? It's more about ancestral ties. Because as we know, both of you, you know, are closer to the US-Mexican border, where we only hear in the news. And of course, we're much more familiar with the American border here, and with COVID in particular, what the issues have been more recently. But with this exhibition, it seemed like as we were talking about this exhibition, we were talking about a discourse about this longitudinal tie, a north-south tie. I think you once termed it the NAFTA tie, right? Although we won't use that anymore. I think it's got a new name now, USMIA or something like that, is that? But this long indigenous longitudinal tie, which is then cross-cut by more the Euro-settler tradition that comes across, right? Which is a very different story. So the cross-cutting of that. So I just want you guys to expand on that, maybe address the idea of that longitudinal relationship I think that we were talking about earlier.
Okay. Well, I think we can maybe start at the medicine wheel. The medicine wheel being one of the, at Wanaskewin being one of the northernmost medicine wheels. And the idea that if we spend time at the medicine wheel, we can begin to look at the medicine wheel as a place symbolically from which all northernmost narratives began to migrate their way southward. And we can also see it as a point where all southernmost narratives eventually arrive too. And when I think about Kade's remarks, and he's talking about the particular sovereignty of context of Canada, that if honored as guests, if, for example, Postcommodity or Postcommodity's capacity for installing a successful installation is based on its ability to understand and communicate within the sovereignty of context provided by the Canadian art world, we have a greater opportunity of positioning work that resonate with our audience. And so that infrastructure that allows us to do, you call it something to the extent of dreaming work, dreaming work. That the source of that is the civic mindedness of the people, because you have the infrastructure, you have the government and civic and indigenous infrastructure to understand the importance of art. And from my perspective, you as citizens understand and advocate for, through your civic duties, the idea that contemporary art is for positioning in a discourse so that we can pedagogically advance and that we can maintain ourselves and that we can begin and that we can think about our future. As Kade was putting, ideally a more desirable future. And so we think a lot about that's really amazing. But how does that narrative begin to cross borders? How does that narrative benefit the Americas? Not just Canada, but the Americas. Because when we think about a truth and reconciliation and we think about Indigenous peoples, we have to think about First Peoples on the lands in which we're living and occupying, but we also have to consider the fact that we share a world. We share a hemisphere together. And so what happens, for example, when things are so good up north, but part of what is required to make things so good up north also contributes to the very real reality that we have created a world that really makes it impossible to be Indigenous in the Americas. And that's why we see millions of people, Indigenous people, migrating northward today. So I think a lot about you're right, this exhibition is not about crossing borders. This exhibition is about reestablishing our ability as Indigenous peoples to see each other again, to remember each other, to remember our relationships, and to try to transgress the dual trilingual European languages that have sought to that have been used to commit cultural genocide against our peoples and our ancestors and our ability to trade and move freely north-south. Because from my perspective, we have always traveled for sacred reasons and for reasons of trade. And this exhibition begins to reopen, I think, a conversation about what that might look like again. And I think it has to happen as a consciousness, as a social consciousness, and it has to happen. And an aspect of that social consciousness is that institutions bear a responsibility. Institutions bear a responsibility to change, and the institutions bear a responsibility to provide knowledge keepers with the resources they need to begin to recover knowledge and reestablish communications.
You know, I think it's really all such like heavy points, and just to think about that in relationship with this idea of Indians without borders. You know, we need to return back and start enacting that from places of self-determination. One of the challenges that we have is ourselves as Indian people. You know, we've inherited the political and cultural chauvinisms of the dominant administrators of power on the land. So it's interesting because American Indians in U.S. Indian, we're all American Indians, but U.S. Indians just they have a tendency to devalue and the Indian realities of people south of the United States border. You don't see a lot of collaboration among tribes across borders. And if we don't start doing that as indigenous peoples, economic collaboration particularly, we can't expect nation states to do it on our behalf in any way that's respectful. So, I mean, it really, we've got to point this at ourselves and realize we've got to be working more strategically across these geopolitical borders, and reconnect with the work of being an interconnected people. Unfortunately, we're so caught up in being anglicized or Hispanicized, or Frankenized, or Portugalized. We lose track of what our own needs and tensions are, and we really lose track of how many biases we're shooting out there to the world just against each other.
Yeah.
The example that a friend, a dear friend that I have, she's been looking at weavings in the Americas and the prices of weavings. And you can look at the same weaving techniques, the same strategies, almost the same visual culture being woven with the material. And if you're in the US and you're Indian weaving and you sell that, let's say it's an 8x10 rug, it's going to sell for thousands and thousands of dollars. That same rug will be $250 if it's made by an indigenous person in Mexico. So this is really, really problematic. We've all reinforced these problematic inequities, and we've all venerated this sort of notion of what authenticity is based on our relationship to our colonizer. And we've reached a point, it's beyond a breaking point. It really is. We've got to disrupt this, and we can't wait on governments to do it. It has to be indigenous led. So a lot of the fingers can point at us for our own failures, but we sure could use some help in changing those things.
We've bought into the theater of borders.
Yeah.
And we use the idea, and I've seen this in academia, we use the idea that we can't communicate to each other because one side speaks French and the other side speaks Spanish, and that's an amnesia to believe in that limitation, because prior to first contact, there were hundreds of thousands of language and language dialects that were spoken, and many are still spoken today on this hemisphere, and it didn't stop us then, and it shouldn't stop us now. We have to find a way to transcend the theater of borders, and that's all it is a theater. You know, it's like a month ago, monsoons came to the desert, the upper Sonoran Desert in Arizona. Millions of dollars in damage to the Great American Wall was enacted upon this border wall. Water just sliced right through it. That's how much of a theater it is. All we need to do is listen to Earth.
Yeah.
I think you have to call it the Trump wall, right?
Yeah.
Since it was called Obamacare, there was often associated languages,
Uh-huh.
right? So, but listen, we're talking about languages, and I think it's quite interesting. We're going to segue into my next question, because you guys work within a particular discursive framework. What's very interesting, I find that I've been working with you guys, you have a particular language. Language, of course, is how we see the world, we express the world, and we conceptualize the world. And for many indigenous peoples, as you were saying earlier, we now speak more what they would call colonial languages. So we see the world through English or French or Portuguese or Spanish languages today, right? And but for you guys, you've been working through language and creating sort of new languages. Let me give you some examples here, and you'll see this in the exhibition and later in the catalog. Some examples might be sovereignty of context. Hacking, of course, we're familiar with, resquache, and reimagined ceremony. I want to talk about reimagined ceremony in a bit, but in a way it's articulating an indigenous experience, right? That's what I think, and I would further suggest, and as Rose had pointed out earlier, the research center I work with is an Indigenous Visual Knowledge, so it's just bringing language, indigenous language, back to this idea. So for me, it's a rediscovery of Cree because I found in using sometimes English or French, there's a limitation in conceptualizing the world. So going back to knowledge keepers from back home, and they're teaching me again, what I'm finding is that I'm seeing the world anew, okay? And so what happens is that, as I said, art historical concepts fail me. So I need to go elsewhere. And I think this is what's happening with you guys. But in a sense now, if we don't have indigenous languages, where do we go to? And I think you've sort of been solving that. So you guys want to talk a bit more about that?
Well, you want to start?
Well, we try to hack language and make it fit our cultural will as much as possible. Try to use it in a way where we can harmonize with the world a little bit. It's not the most articulate way of doing that. It would be a lot easier to speak Cherokee, and I'm ashamed that I'm not a fluent Cherokee speaker when I have so many family members that are. It's one of the negative aspects of growing up in Bakersfield. But we have the tools that we all have different tools that we're sort of stuck with, and we just try to reimagine those tools to work in service of us, in service of what we're trying to achieve, in service of our families, in service of our clans and our tribes, and all the things that we've inherited that are exercised through our worldview. So the thing about language is interesting is you get to externalize a lot of internal experiences, and you get to share that process in real time. And so it's the part of talking that's actually really interesting, and it's nice to share that struggle, because if I was speaking just Cherokee with you all, you wouldn't be able to see the struggle that, you know, that we are all sharing to communicate so that we can all, you know, participate together in this. So, you know, there's that. But to me, you could take it one step deeper and think of it as every time you hack a word or recontextualize a word to generate a different meaning, or you know, to be a different referent, or to position a metaphor in an unusual way. You know, this is what we're obligated to do, and we're just trying to fulfill that obligation. You know, because we're trying to make meaning ultimately through language, and humans are meaning-making machines, and we're just doing the best we can in the hacking of language to form meaning without having that foundational reliance upon a Judeo-Christian Western scientific worldview. You know, that's the challenge, is how do you communicate really where you're coming from when you're not coming from a Judeo-Christian Western scientific worldview culturally, but linguistically you are. You know, that's quite it's an irresolvable dilemma. And for some people, that irresolvable dilemma is very, very exciting and empowering, and while it's fraught with multiple failures and limitations, the potential is tremendous. And I think that's the obligation we both carry and recognize and build together to support each other as artists and as a field of you know, Indigenous, you know, thinkers and people, you know.
Thank you. Yeah.
He's a linguist, so I don't know why I talked.
No, he talks because he makes my brain explode. That's why he talks. And I hope I do the same for him. That's what we try to do for each other.
It's so funny.
And so, I'll just see where I can start. One is when you think about hacking, and hacking is a form of survivance. Where I'm from the borderlands. I'm mestizo. Mestizo isn't federally recognized like Métis is recognized here in Canada. We're come from Genizaros. Genizaros are people who were brought up north, like people from Tlaxcala and different places in Mexico were brought up by the Spanish, and essentially detribalized historically, and have communities throughout northern New Mexico, where mestizos are mixed with Jews who were fleeing persecution from Spain and had established crypto practices in northern New Mexico. Mestizos are part of the Tewa, Tiwa, Towa, Zuni, and Hopi worlds. Navajo, Apache, Comanche. Let's not forget about the Comanche. And so we're on a border. And at the same time, we're near a border. And so when you have that kind of layering of history, you start to find working examples that are oftentimes markers by which subjugators use to pejoratively place a people. For example, some of the language that was used when New Mexico Territory was annexed as a state, some of the language that was used to describe my people, mestizos, were words like mongrel. Why are we being called mongrel? Well, it's because in a racializing society, we defy the expectation of a box one can check to clearly define for oneself in a body politic who one is. But, you know, we know as linguists that everyone is mestizo, essentially. Everyone has a mixed and very, or should I say, everyone has a complex ancestral history.
Yeah, there you go.
But we have Genesis amnesia. We prefer it because it's convenient and it helps us simplify. Especially around all of the things that make us feel uncomfortable by the way that we perceive difference in one another. But if you go to New Mexico, I see that the subjugating a working example that is used as a way of subjugating in the Spanish lineages in Latin America would pejoratively refer to things as rascuache, kind of like another thing that I see happening for black people, like ghetto, like that's so ghetto, or that, wow, that's really rascuache. And it's because they're making fun of how we speak, because in our language we have Tewa influence, we have Spanish, primarily Spanish, but it's been hacked. And so it's got Tewa influence, and it's got Navajo influence, and Apache, and Nahuatl. Nahuatl, the language you see in the text piece that we have upstairs, and the humor, and so you can tell jokes in a kind of and Spanglish, and then it goes all the way to Spanglish, and that's sort of seen as pejorative, but linguists know, social linguists know, this is the stuff language is made of. And so when you go to Spain, for example, and you tell a joke from where I'm from, a Spaniard will not understand the humor in it. Because we're not speaking the same language. It's been hacked. It's been indigenized. And that's what we do with material. That's what we do with contexts. We use this ability we use our tools to reconfigure reality so that we might see an alternative way of being, of knowing, of believing, of valuing. And so that shows up all over the place, like that that chemical storage tank that is also a resonant drum.
The term hacking he was just pointing out, we're familiar with it in PI, right? Or IT, I should say. It's an interesting term. It's, somebody might have used it before. They might have used being tricksterish at one time, right? You guys use it, however, in a very interesting way, because the idea is modifying the original, right? It's allowing us to see the world differently, to speak about it differently, and you may be hacking the museum, as it were.
Oh, yeah.
But you're also, what's interesting is you're also hacking the indigenous world as well. And particularly this notion of reimagined ceremony. So where you're taking an original idea, but developing a different, and in this case, in a context of an art museum. So could you talk about that for a little bit, about this note, and take us further about hacking, because there's lots of works up here that you work with this idea.
Right on.
You're going to want to tee
Go
this.
for it. You go get it rolling.
Well, I got to bring Yazi into this conversation because I remember we were setting up this show at the Ice House, and we had got a grant from there.
The Ice House is where?
In Phoenix.
Phoenix, okay.
We got a grant to work on we thought we were going to be able to do repellent fence with a $5,000 grant.
And you'll see that here.
So, yeah, we had to use that money for something, and we did a one-night deal. You know, we had been to the Czech Republic, and we're really impressed with the Czech underground and the Polish undergrounds, what they were doing artistically, where they go away from town to, you know, more isolated, you know, smaller villages, and they would share their work there in private. And, you know, these things would start around 11 o'clock at night, and by 4 a.m. there's no evidence of anything except like beer cans or something, or bottles and other stuff. But that idea influenced this work we did at the Ice House back in 2007, and it was a reimagined ceremony, and it was called worldview manipulation therapy. And I remember we were playing with that word, and Yazi looked up at me, he goes, reimagined ceremony? Is that what this is? Like that? And so that entered, yeah, because we were just like making shit up and writing it. You know, we didn't know what any of it meant at that time. We were just purely aspirational. And it came out that he brought a term to the table that was really important. And it was like, once he said that, we looked at each other and went like, oh, yeah, I guess we should think about it like this. And in that kind of framing, we're using something that's familiar to us. You know, we go to ceremonies about transformative experience, and they're really purposeful. And a lot of ceremonies are just about resetting the balance, nothing more, just restoring balance in very particular ways. And you do this because you enter into a world of symbolic exchange, to where you embody through the ceremonial practice the thing that is the purpose of the ceremony. Like a green corn dance for Cherokees, we become corn when we're dancing. We don't think about it, we are it, we're embodying it. So it's through symbolic exchange and performance, performing that, it establishes a relational applied knowledge experience with the cause and effect relationship that's being isolated and taken and placed into the ceremonial context. And that's what I think we were trying to achieve at the Ice House in 2007, and have been doing it ever since. Is we worked for 2 months on a show that was only open to the public for one night. You know, we got to work in about an 8,000 square foot, you know, space, you know, gallery space. We filled the entire thing with work, and we didn't care, because we were at that point, we were discovering what reimagined ceremony was in a very deep, real way, a very intentional way. And at that time, we also discovered what the sovereignty of context was. The sovereignty of context was that, were those few hours where people could be in the door, in the collapse of time around them, and all of this visual knowledge surrounding them that they're engaging, that they're immersed within, and that they have to negotiate and navigate as humans, you know, and rationalize after the experience by sharing, you know, as humans. So that was one of the ways to where we got that. Of course, Cristóbal had a very similar art practice, and that was where we met, that was doing the exact same thing with Radio Healer. And I went to his show, I was like, oh shit, we need to work together.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, what you said is also going to start to make me cry. And Sebastian, I think in the audience here somewhere, is making fun of me because I become more emotional, I think, as grown older, but
Nothing wrong with that, man.
but you know, the thing about what Kade is saying is that I was working on my PhD at the time and very concerned about emergent media and digital media and thinking about it as literacy version 2.0. And you know, reading and writing is so devastating to many Native people in the Americas. And we can't say all Native people. We still had reading and writing. We had forms of reading and writing here, but the particular Western style of reading and writing was very devastating. And then now we have this literacy 2.0 that's sweeping across the entire world. And we're both concerned. We're having very intense conversations because he's working on policy for broadband communications on indigenous lands, access to broadband, Native American access to broadband. At the same time, I'm tearing my hair out trying to understand how this is going to change us, and with great concern. And we had incredible conversations together, debating and discussing the possibilities. And this was all moving lightning fast, of course. And at the same time, I had an indigenous hacker collective, and we would hack these technologies, and we would fashion them into new tools. And so this idea of rascuache, or hacking, although had been used pejoratively against us, we were reclaiming that word. Just like lowriders had reclaimed that word long before in the 60s and the 70s and so forth. That's a place from which we derive power. And that's why people are so damn afraid of it. And so I was thinking, what does it mean for ceremony to be situated within the context of digital media? And I'm trembling as I say this. I was very scared because that was an idea. And I didn't know how elders would feel about that. And I did not want to be disrespectful. And I began to gain the confidence and the courage to approach elders on the issue because I met Postcommodity. And Postcommodity had this term, reimagined ceremony. And that gave me the courage to ask elders what they thought about digitally mediated ceremony. And what I found out is that they were light years ahead of any of us in our thinking. They already knew. They knew it was coming. I'm saying this generally speaking in terms of the limited number of elders whom I had conversations with. And we are looking forward to really expanding those conversations with the future project, Cosmovisión. But the thing is that this idea of reimagined ceremony is that it's one idea is that we're not trying to in any way critique indigenous ceremony, not in any way. We're not trying to create an idea by which those who believe in New Age things, we're not trying to empower New Age thinking in any way at all. But what we are trying to do is we're trying to honor the world of our ancestors by continuing the traditions of organizing, helping to catalyze the organization and gathering of people so that we can have shared experiences that enable us to rationalize a very fast changing world. Because, like my great-grandfather, the world he grew up in was not too different than the world my grandfather grew up in. But the world that my grandfather grew up in, the world that my dad had grown up in, it was already changing quite a bit. Already by the generation, the up and coming generation, my 9-year-old niece is living in a world that my grandfather will not recognize. And so only through the continuation of the continuum of storytelling are we going to continue to emerge to advance our self-determination. And so I think that we need a new language, and we struggle to find a new language. We're still struggling to find new language. That's going to be with us, I think, till the day we die, for sure.
You know, as I listen to you guys, it just reminds me when some people will say, you know, we have always been modern, right? Indigenous peoples have always been modern. And I think if we look at that idea and what you're saying about a reimagined ceremony is a respect for the original.
Hell
Yes?
yeah.
A respect for the old ways. You talked about elders. Elders are always coeval with the time. So in effect, they are modern, yes?
Yes.
And I was looking at that at the work here in the idea of the ceremony, because it's not just you guys involved in, and ceremonies often are positioning things in the right place, yeah? But everybody's involved in it. You, the audience, the visitor, right? They're experiencing, they're having an aesthetic experience as they go through the exhibition, much as you'd have a spiritual experience going through a ceremony. So the kind of combination of the two, I think there's a, you know, looking at it, it's a very fine point, mind you, but I think just taking the concept, the original concept, and understanding that and respecting it, to me, is really important. So
Yes.
reimagining that is what you're doing, and you're getting the audience to reimagine it. I don't know if you want to close on that, because I think we're slowly running out of time, because I want to get to some questions from the audience as well from online. Yeah.
I think there's a tight relationship between reimagined ceremony and hacking that I guess we can go back to trying to close that. And, you know, being here with Gerald, one of the giants of the field, and really inspiring, like so many folks in the U.S. and Canada and throughout the world. There's another really important PhD art historian who came just before Gerald, a woman named Mary Jo Watson, Yuchi Seminole Cree. And she was a longtime professor at the University of Oklahoma, art history. She eventually became the chair of the art department. And at the time, she was, if not the first, one of the only full professors, Indigenous people in the entire United States. So huge. And you just think about the battles she had to go through in the 70s, trying to, you know, in academics, wrestling with these things. So she had to speak in broad generalizations and in codes to communicate to her Indian students. And Nathan and I were both in her class, and the thing that she said, and this is all we're doing, because I don't think hacking it's natural, it's something we just do. It gets named, so there may be some complexity associated and some veneration around, well, we're on a stage talking about it, but it's something that's part of our daily lives. And she would say this all the time. She'd go, one of the things that is our greatest strength as Indian people is to take any foreign material and reimagine it to serve us, our will, you know. So that was what she thought of as art history. Art history post-contact in this hemisphere is a history of that process. And that was the framing that she brought to her art criticism and way of engaging Indian art. And so I'd like to just acknowledge that, you know, these ideas come from generations before us, and they come from histories, and they come from processes. I was going to say processes, just but from processes that we've shared, you know, for about 500 years or so. And I'd like to think we're just continuing on those traditions.
Absolutely.
You know, because that algorithm was placed on this land before us. We're just taking it, running with it, and trying to, you know, do something productive, you know, on behalf of the people who came before us.
You know, there's so many connections as Kade is learning this definition of hacking and in American Indian Studies. I'm learning it as a professor in Chicano Studies, where I learn of this scholar who's probably around the same time as Mary Jo Watson, who is talking about Rascuache and his Tomás Ibarra Fraustro. And he wrote a treatise on Chicano art and talked about how the act of extemporaneous design, you know, like adaptive reuse, extemporaneous design, is the genesis of Chicano self-determination, cultural self-determination, and action. And I think it goes back to some of the early, more irrational language that I used at the beginning. There's sort of circular way that I try to understand how the hell did we end up here. It's like that in so many aspects of post-commodity, where there's just parallel thinking, and we just happen to meet each other the right time and place, and it just sort of went from there.
That's what you tell art students. They always wonder, like, how am I going to get from point A to point B? Well, your research is going to take you there.
Yeah.
Invest in your research. Your research will invest in you.
Yeah.
You know, and that's really what's happened with post-commodity. So I guess it's real easy for us to say that because it's so literal. The experience has been so literal.
And we're through the other side of it now, right? But back then it was like.
I just wanted to point to this image here because we're going to be going out here following our talk. And why I wanted to talk about it was this notion of a friend of ours. I'm not sure if you've met him yet, but he's written in the book Floyd Fable. He left me with this idea, and I think it's apropos to our idea. He calls it medicine thinking. Maski hi mamtanaitsigewen, as we would say in Cree. And because he talks about a worldview, and you guys have talked about a worldview, because it all begins with the land, yes? And so when we think about that, that's where ceremony begins, on the land. And you have done some work previously, and I want you to kind of make the connections perhaps in anticipation of going out to Waniskewin with another work that you did, the Lax Art piece, right? Which has a kind of ceremonial idea of return, of doing things. Ceremonies, as we all know, are done again and again and again. Since the beginning of time, we continue to do it, yes? And we all participate in ceremony. But this notion of a medicine thinking, I think, is really quite critical and quite important, and I think goes into some of your work. So maybe make those ties for us that are about to go to Waniskewin this afternoon.
Okay, I'll take one approach to this medicine thinking idea, is that medicine thinking, for me, there has to be something pragmatic about it, meaning it has to lead to something that is useful. And so one idea of medicine thinking is we can tell stories like the many stories that are upstairs, or like this story of lowriding and the history of LA and Hollywood and a contemporary art gallery. And that's one usefulness. That's one of the pragmatisms employed in our art practice and in making art. The other is we believe in institutions. We don't think institutions are where they need to be right now. We think institutions need to be transformed. And so we do a lot of this medicine thinking for the purposes of shifting the conversation, the direction, the discourse, and the thinking of the institution itself by operating on the institution, on the infrastructure of the institution. Like one example is this piece with the columns that are painted in a lowrider style. And that creates a place for dialogues, cyclical dialogues, indigenous people of LA to come together and to think through some of the issues of the time. But another example is what we've achieved here, some of the medicine thinking that has been achieved here in terms of how we're operating with, in collaboration with, while on the institution, is Facing the Wall with Pablo Picasso. And beginning to think about, well, how do we help the institution unburden itself so that it might have the ability to think even more complexly about art, not through the orthodoxy or any kind of orthodoxy of post-commodity, but through the lens of syncretizing knowledge. It takes a post-commodity in relationship to a Picasso, mediated by a concept of neutralizing certain ways in which art is venerated and speculated upon in order to create a condition conducive for the proliferation of indigenous knowledge and Western knowledge, and syncretizing, and maybe in many ways in conflict, but very proximate to one another, so that we can see ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so I think the medicine thinking is creating a comedy of sorts, in which we can all have a moment where we sort of find ourselves in a state of shock because we realize that we're implicated in very much implicated in having created the world that we live in. Mm-hmm. And we can see the injustices, but we can also see the beauty. And that maybe through all of the ways that things align and converge and diverge, that we just might learn or might come to a place where we can appreciate each other's gifts of difference to one another. And in that, maybe there's a healing. Mm. That's the best shot I could take at that right now.
Right. Well, when I think of that piece at LAX Art, I think of, the intentions behind it really intersect the conversation of hacking and of reimagined ceremony. And that project evolved from really a dilemma around these columns. And it became the focus.
And that's a pragmatism right there. We got columns in the way.
Yeah, the piece we wanted to do in the room didn't work. It wasn't going to work. And not only that, it just wasn't going to look good in that space, even if we wanted to. The more we got familiar with the space, the more we realized, oh crap, we got to do something else. And that's kind of where we are. That's the human endeavor, right? Is the first plan for all of us, regardless of our culture, isn't the thing that we expected or imagined. It's always, you have to check down and, plan 2, plan 3, plan 4. That's one of the great things about what makes us humans, is we can be pragmatic and change direction and still achieve really amazing things. Building ceremonial complexes, that's what it became, an endeavor to build a ceremonial complex. And it was a place that we imagined, a place where people could gather annually, Chicano community, indigenous community, and think about who we are as people across language, across being Hispanicized or Anglicized, and to reconnect. And build that connection outward from that point to to a diversity of communities, to where we could come together as a group of diverse peoples and reflect on how we're sharing land together in a venerated cultural space of Los Angeles. That LAX Art's one of those spaces in LA that, you look at the board members, and it's such a powerful roster of artists and administrators and thinkers, and it's this very vulnerable and venerated space because it's always so much smaller than what it produces. It's almost like you are going into a portal when you enter that space, because the work that gets staged there is so much bigger than the gallery space, and then the discourse around it is so much bigger than the gallery space. And so to actually, and it hasn't a very short history of showing brown people. I remember Ruben Ochoa's probably had one of the great works shown at LAX Art back when it was in Culver City. He cut and up the floor and made sculpture with a rebar and concrete, leaving it attached to the floor in a much different way than we address the floor at the ASU Art Museum. Just great work. It was so ambitious. It's a small place, huge ambitions, great curation. So the idea of building a ceremonial complex in there is a little difficult and very, very aspirational. But we did it with the knowledge of how Indian people build ceremonial places. I am from the Cherokee Nation. When I was born in 1971, the vast majority of Cherokees didn't even know that we existed as a nation, as a political entity. We only existed at the stomp grounds. The Cherokee history from 1870 to 1970 is about as dark as Indian history as you'll ever come across. And it was from 1971 to now, we've rebuilt all of our social and cultural infrastructure. Built it from relationships, from practice, from working with tribes we used to war with, And so my lifetime has been a lifetime of reestablishing ceremonial spaces. And the thing that we've learned is you don't build it and they come. That's not how ceremonial spaces work. Ceremonial spaces have to be co-built, co-determined, co-located, and meaning has to be constructed around it, and it has to be practiced. There's so much that goes into it before that space is even activated. And so what is happening at LAX Art isn't for now, it's for 20 or 30 years from now. And we have to work diligently to try to be a part of that process. But we didn't create that with the idea that, we're at the next winter solstice and summer solstice, we're going to have these, badass rock star gatherings of artists. No, it's like maybe in 5 years we'll get 20 people, the 20 right people that we need there. And we can make sense out of this so that when the larger public comes in, it'll have impact and lasting power, And those are the kinds of things you have to build into work. And the art world doesn't privilege that type of work. But when you find those institutions and they're out there and they are alive, and you can find curators that are there, and you can find board members that are doing it. LaxArt is doing it. This place is doing it. And we try to find those places to where time can be reimagined as indigenous time, where future, present, and past are one. They're always being realized. They're always being negotiated. And when you find spaces, institutions that enable that, you are finding the future of how we as a humanity have to work across worldview and collectively towards a common goal. It's starting to happen. These instances, these ruptures. In the 60s, they didn't happen. There were no Indian artists able to do this. There's no one, this didn't exist. So it's one step at a time, and knowing what we're modeling and trying to work collectively and intelligently, not to mess it up. Because we know what it's like not to have a seat at the table. And when we have a seat at the table, we want it to function in a way like it's truly our seat, not someone else's that they pulled out for us to sit in. But that seat, applying Mary Jo Watson's logic, indigenous logic, of reimagining what a chair is so that it can fulfill and be in service to indigenous people in a way that is harmonized with this hemisphere so that it can, by extension, be in service to non-indigenous people equally as well.
Absolutely.
That's where we're at.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is a rupture, as Kade pointed. This is a rupture. Part of what makes it a rupture is that for the first time in Postcommodity's career, even after building many reimagined or ceremonial complex spaces, we finally found an institutional partner that was willing to put their resources, their intentions, and their capacity for transformation forward, moving it beyond just mere symbolic exchange or rhetoric to steward a work of art in perpetuity that is designed to function and serve a community of the future. They didn't paint over it. They didn't sand it off.
They
Right.
didn't. They commissioned us to build covers, to preserve it, so that they could steward it responsibly. It's like the covers are built in the way that like a cedar box is built to hold medicine and a rattle and feather for ceremony, you know, with tremendous care and thoughtfulness and simple beauty. And they are the stewards about it. One thing that's really interesting, of all the work we've done, that piece didn't get written about at all. Like, it didn't get covered by the LA Times. It didn't get covered by any local press. So there's still not there's a tension around the concept of what is really going on. There's a misunderstanding or a lack of awareness about what's at stake. And we need to change, you know, that's what we're trying to change, is build power around these ideas so that they could be shared, and you know.
And it did get written about in Flash in our forum, but we're talking about local,
Yeah,
right? Local organizing,
yeah.
you know, writers.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
Well, gentlemen, what can I say?
this guy knows how to get it out of us.
We're about to cross another border boundary in a few moments. Collectively, we're going to cross from summer into fall. Yeah? It's an important time of year. And I think we mark these kinds of times of year in the land, like the medicine wheel and other prominent markers, right? And so it's a beautiful day. Right? It's a beautiful day. And I really would like to thank Kade and Cristóbal, and you especially, the audience, who have been so kind and generative in your laughter and your clapping and et cetera. So to really, I think it's an honor for the artists for you to be here. And they really appreciate it, as do I. And I'd like you to join me, and I want to respect you all and respect the artists with a round of applause. Thank you very much. Okay, now, so I don't know if you raised the lights on the place or not with some questions. We have an opportunity to go out online as well, correct, Rose? Okay, are you going to be handling that, or who is handling that?
Oh, wow.
Okay. Is there a question from out there already?
We have a couple online.
Great, okay, let's start with them. And meanwhile, the audience can come up with their own thoughts.
All right. I have a question online. I'll start with one from Meredith Tromble. Would you discuss one or two specific works from the exhibition in context of how they push the Indigenous lens outwards?
Wow, they all do. It's just a matter of choosing one.
There's an image. Most of the images here are from previous work. There's two actually that are on display. One is Let Us Pray for the Water Between Us. That was started at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, and it is now here on the 3rd floor. The other one, you'll see a lovely drawing by Laurie McGilvery, who's the architect, right? And you'll see that as well here. So if you want to address at least those two visually, I mean, online later we'll add the images. But
maybe if you can get us rolling with the truck hunting.
Oh,
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Like, we could talk a little bit about the relationship between mid-century modernism and land use per, square foot development, and the checkerboarding and all this stuff that we encountered while working in Palm Springs.
yeah, the thing about the truck hunting piece, and this is truck hunting out near Agua Caliente, and that's the reservation that, and the tribal lands that the city of Palm Springs was built on. It's a very contested space, as you might imagine, with limited water resources and a growing population and a very arid desert. It was home for an experiment. The challenge was to find an architectural form that you could construct an economy of scale around.
This one right here.
That
This is a conceptual rendering.
that could be modular and positioned and from multiple perspectives and appear different. So sameness and difference. And to be able to blanket a large plot of land and get a maximum square inch yield out of that land. Farmers did it really great, and they paved the way for developers to do it with houses. If you look at the history of the Southwest development, you find all of the development taking place on farmland. And there's a really great Phoenix artist that has addressed that in his practice, Matthew Moore. But the thing about this is the illusion. The prompt was to create an illusion and to create an economic rationale for the illusion. And that prompt was extended to a series of a number of architects. Let's create an 800 square foot tract home that we could sell the hell out of and mobilize a workforce around and an industry around. And I don't know how many architects were part of it, but there were quite a few, and they all had their take on it. And a lot of the ideals of mid-century, mid-modern ideals of, bringing the outside in, the outside out, open span, light, transparency, across the space. Those kinds of ideals were injected into the conversation as a way of rationalizing a cheaply constructed cube. They tried to aestheticize the cube as much as possible, but at the end of the day, it was a rectangular cube and it would be positioned this way, this way, this way, on the lot. So you'd have different profiles. And so the superficial things like truss lines became very important for differentiation. And this truss line of the zigzag, the butterfly truss is one of those iconic semiotics of mid-century design. For instance, it's at Dodger Stadium in the outfield. It's worked its way into our psychology, but it was like putting lipstick on a pig. And that pig is the development industry that's transformed county lands, state lands, federal lands into a monotonous sea of suburban development that has rendered entire regions, not landscapes, but entire regions unsustainable, and has created a mountain of social, cultural, political, economic, and healthcare dilemmas, which a lot of our work examines. And it just so happened that 2 generations, at least in the US, that are venerated, the Great Generation and the Baby Boomer generation, this was their project. Their project was economic growth at the expense of everything. And the only way you could rationalize your existence in this hemisphere was through expansion. That DNA from Manifest Destiny exists within the economic frameworks of rationalizing investment and monetizing investment. So we wanted to take that semiotic, hold all of us accountable to it, because it's our generation who collects these houses as if they're art pieces, Don't live in them, just collect them. Because that's the thing about these houses, they're all empty. They have furniture in it, but they're just sitting there empty. They have security, they're heavily surveilled, but they're hollow shells now, just as they were when they were first created.
And they're impractical.
Yeah, they're totally impractical, but it's lipstick on a pig is all it is. It is a rationalization of one of the most tragic experiences of this hemisphere is the total transformation, and it can never be undone, of the Southwest and Southern California. So we imagined, like my dad put a lot of toilets in on those houses. He's a plumber. And because, these subdivisions as they were being built, he was growing up in his profession as a plumber during that time, so he put a lot of toilets in. So we imagine ourselves as being, who we are 40 years ago, and going hunting and driving our truck out there and looking out the window and seeing a good roof line and taking our skill saws and hopping the construction fence and cutting the roof off and throwing it in the back of the truck, and then hauling it back home to hang in the garage and let the blood, drip out of it, and then process it and taxidermy it, And so in a lot of ways that's our taxidermy. So we're looking out at this architectural form as a semiotic, as a negotiator of meaning, and also a negotiator of economic expansion on a massive scale, unprecedented up to that time. And the generations who were intellectually and conceptually behind it, they're not just represented in that work, they're represented in the works that are adjoining that work. You look at Going to Water as a multi-channel video installation that is documenting, a lake, Owens Lake, which was one of the largest it was the largest drainage lake on the east side of the Sierras. This thing went for miles and miles and miles and miles and miles. And this is where Indians from all around the Great Basin would come and gather. And, you know, if you know about the Great Basin, it's a high desert, and it's between two mountain ranges, so it's shadowed. It doesn't get a lot of water, period. So it was incredibly important. But LA Water and Power drained that lake for its own purposes against and in spite of the resistance of the tribes that all lived adjacent to that lake, Big Pine, Lone Pine, and Bishop. So they weren't stakeholders in that decision. It just happened. And you can watch Chinatown, the Hollywood movie, kind of dramatizes some of the aspects and some of the power stakeholders, and the names of LA streets like Mulholland are a part of that narrative. It was a power grab, and it was a development grab. That was done so that that house could live. You know, there's a tight relationship to those things. The result is that lake bed is dry now. The water that used to go there gets sucked out immediately. And what's interesting is, because the dirt there is so fine, and the wind blows it, and the particulate matter makes it so dangerous to breathe, and the instances of cancer there are the highest in the U.S., primarily tribal people, but that as they have to allocate water from the water that they're taking from there still to run a sprinkler system, and they have to water that huge miles and miles of land
To keep the dust down.
to keep the dust, to
down.
mitigate it.
Yeah.
So that interconnected narrative is there. And, you know, not to like go on and on and on, but the piece Elders First, we're memorializing the same elders as well. It just so happens that they died. We're losing our elders at a time to where they're viewed as only economic material. They're not viewed as storehouses of knowledge and history and culture, experience of humanity. They're not viewed as our leaders. They're viewed as a resource to extrapolate, exploit. They're viewed as an economy that we can align goods and services with. And so that trio of work is looking outward intensely and sharing our history with that vantage point, and sharing values that we hold through that vantage point.
And I want to lean in.
Yeah.
Go on and
Yeah,
on
yeah,
and
do it.
even more, because
Thank you.
you know all this devastation. It was, if you think about the colonization of the Americas, are built around a discourse of predestination, right? Manifest destiny. Manifest destiny leads to the ultimate weapon of mass destruction, which is the atomic bomb. And so these houses were fueled by an ideology tied to atomic age optimism. Mm-hmm. It was going to be the time when humanity rose above it all, with the promise of this energy being a clean energy, a kind of way to find absolution or perhaps redemption for having created genocidal acts and justified them as a way to end the war. Well, that DNA, that way of thinking, led to all of the construction of all of these systems that have led to gross devastation of the land and people and elders. And so then you walk into another room and you find a pyramid upstairs, encoded in the colors that are used to categorize hazardous materials. But at the same time, coincidentally, maybe not, but those same colors are indigenous medicine colors. How do we get our minds around that? how do we find a way forward where for one people, these colors represent toxicity, while for another peoples, they are medicine? This pyramid is demonstrating the ways in which nuclear waste is stored. It's also a memorial to family members of ours who have passed away due to exposure of nuclear fissile material. It's also a way of remembering the shared knowledge, the sharing of knowledge, south, north, north to south, in that people built pyramids throughout the Americas and mounds. And so when you think about how do these pieces, how is an indigenous worldview encoded in examples of our work? It's just simply encoded by us operating in a manner or behaving in a manner by which we were raised. And that's what we got. That's our inheritance. And that's sacred. And so we use our inheritance in order so that we may manifest ideas in the world, so that the ideas can be pointed to in a way that perhaps other people cannot manifest. Mm-hmm. That's what we bring to the table.
Mm-hmm. Hands. One hand. Do I get two? I think there's a young lady going up to the mic.
All right.
Could you identify yourself and your question, please? Thank
Sure.
you.
Thank you, Miigwech. Merci à tous. I wanted to say thank you so much. Gracias aussi. My name is Jake Moore. I'm the director of the University Art Galleries and Collections here at University of Saskatchewan, and an assistant professor in art and art history. But I was born on Treaty 1 territory in San Boniface, Manitoba. So, Sébastien, je pense que vous êtes là et je suis très content. Okay. So happy to see you here and so grateful for your continued contributions with the glyphs and the symbolics you work with. It's so rich to see that. And when I think about the syllabary, the Cherokee syllabary, mm-hmm. and you're marking that moment in time of like what happened from 1870. So the richness of the work is so, my body's constantly churning in my response to it. So what I wanted to ask you about, because I feel like I've been talking to you ever since I knew you existed, and you may not have heard me, but I have been talking to you. So I want to talk about volume. I want to ask you about volume, mm-hmm. and in that I mean all of that, like volumes, containers, holders, as well as the possibility of resonance turning to sound and becoming acoustic for others. And I'm thinking in particular here about the drum, the large drum that holds toxins, and then the driver within it that makes that constant reminder that there's something sonic here, there's something that's resonating. And then I think about when I go into the Picasso room and how the museum asserts itself every time those fucking doors close. It's the biggest drum here, is that bang, bang, bang. And I think about how the volume of what you've brought into the room is operating at this, it's almost the infrasonic, right? And like, so it is here in my body. And as I walk towards the drum, I feel it, it changes me. Mm-hmm. But when I'm trying to engage this other space, there's this like, bam! Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering for you, because you are so consciously looking at your own implication within the museology, mm-hmm. all the structures you engage, and how you activate them, were you conscious of that sort of assertion that was going to be present here of the loudness of the institution?
Good question. Thanks, Jake.
That's an excellent question. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think that all of the theories encoded in your question about resonances, about volume, about feeling in the gut, that intelligence that emanates from the gut, those are all things that feel really comfortable about and comfortable with, because going back to a reimagined ceremony, the idea of making a place or resonating with place and positioning and complex that we can embody physically, that those are strong intentions of ours. We feel like we have to we aestheticize ideas, scenarios, so that they can be experienced and embodied in an embodied way, and it's that very experience, it's that very embodied experience that is at the heart of what we're trying to craft. And so we have been extremely conscious of our role and the ways in which we self-implicate, and the ways in which we imagine the implication of others, our audience, throughout almost 2 years of very highly invested and very, very thoughtful dialogues, really built around protocols of listening to each other. And so the placement of things and again, honoring the sovereignty of context, like having a drum that points to environmental pollution while within the context of a river, framing the drum. These are all things that we thought very deeply about. But now we were supposed to, in an ideal world, we were supposed to come to Saskatoon a few times prior to the installation of this exhibition, and then the world had a plan of its own. And so COVID-19 became a global pandemic, and we were no longer able to come and listen, like in the physical environment. And so the way that we listened to the physical environment happened through the way that we listened to each other in collaborating with people in Saskatoon and in other places in Canada via Zoom meetings. But I feel like, everything vibrates in the universe. Everything is oscillating. And we don't... I think that we're always, we really are inspired by ideas of deep listening, and that we think that listening is extremely key to what needs to happen in our world today. We see that this is being usurped every day, the sovereignty and the sacredness of listening. But we could not have anticipated the slamming of the door, to the Picasso Museum, but it makes a logical sense, and it's obviously what we are trying to begin to in a dialogical way, very thoughtfully trying to engage with when we face the Picasso prints to the wall. And so in a way, maybe we anticipated it. In another way, I'm really glad that it's there, because it is in a dialogue with a drum.
When I think of volume, I think of displacement, as well. And especially being a surfer and a snowboarder, you're always trying to displace water, surfing, throw big sprays on a turn and stuff, and snow, same way. But in a space, you know, you have to, part of the challenge of bringing something in is to harmonize it with the space somehow. And like the video installations, there's a lot of time that goes into just tuning the room for this, you know, the sound component. There's so much focus on the visual, but it's always the sound part of a video installation that's the hardest aspect to just get right. And with the drum, we never stopped trying to make it better. The whole time we've been here, we would work on it, stop, go back to it, work on it, stop, go back to it, all the way up to like just a couple hours before it opened. It's that tension, and you know, and I hate to use the word displacement and things like that, but it does represent a physical property of how sound, you know, is functioning, the air being displaced and things of that nature. It does provide an interesting type of metaphorical framing for how these objects can sit in the space. And I think it speaks to the team that we worked with here. Is we all managed that displacement together, and we were all stakeholders in the decision making for that form of displacement. It was something we all had to be sensitive to and manage and try to cite the best we can. And it was probably one of the things, the carefulness or astuteness or sensitivity to how that was managed is probably what made the collaboration so extraordinary, because everyone on this end of the Zoom call knew we liked sound and knew that that was an issue and that all of these things were going to be animated with sound. So that brought a stability to the conversation. That one consideration was really a huge factor outside of like budget constraints and logistics and things.
One thing about listening, and it doesn't matter how deep you go with listening, and here's the self-implicating story behind the story. When we were working on the drum, we installed it, we came here, we listened to the drum in the space. And so we have the story here is that we have to be careful we have to question ourselves critically about what we think we're listening, what we think we're hearing when we listen. So for example, when we came and observed the drum, it had a bass kind of tone to it. It also had a tone as if a racket was smacking a tennis ball at the leading edge of the tone, and then it had a little bass in it, and then it just had a lot of noise, talking about noise in the building and rattling. The first thing we did as a collective is we said, man, the rafters in the building are just rattling like hell. So the blame is on the structure.
Uh-huh.
And then now we have to ask ourselves, well, do we like that we're rattling the structure? What is the meaning of that rattling? And where is it coming from? And it was clear. It was observable as we stood at the foot of the drum. So later on, when we were getting ready to go up into the ceiling to figure out where the building noise was coming from, we got up onto the scissor lift, and we had an epiphany. It now appeared from this vantage that the noise was actually not coming from the building at all, but it was all of it completely coming from the drum. And the reason why we thought it was coming from the building is because the porthole where the sound was coming through was reflecting right from the ceiling and coming right down. And so when you're down below, it felt like it was coming from the building's infrastructure. So we have to be really careful about the assumptions we make about one another. And we're also acutely aware of that when it comes to Picasso. There's a lot of things we're doing that we know with relationship to Picasso. There's a lot of things we don't know. And you never know what that banging means. That banging, we need to listen to it because it may be telling us something about this situation that we're not yet currently understanding.
Yeah. That's great. That's great. Excellent.
That's exactly where I wanted you to get, and I really appreciate the generosity of speech. And
Thank
I
you.
just also want to say thanks for the Black Flag t-shirt.
The snake meat T-shirt. Did you get that one? Okay, I think Rose is going to do the big announcement, I guess, now.
The land is expecting us.
Okay,
at
excellent,
Wanaskewin.
excellent.
So I think there'll be more opportunities for dialogue as the exhibition is on through the end of January. And we'll probably be doing some more talks and discussions in association with the publication launch later this year. So thank you all for joining us here. We hope some of you will follow us there. And please enjoy your time with the exhibition. Thank you for
Thank
listening
you.
today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thank you. Thanks, guys. All right. Good work.
That was
Okay, let's get out.
Oh, yeah.